Hello everyone. Thanks for watching this video. This video will teach you how to do SQL Server create table statements, insert statements, and select statements. So this video is something you'll want to watch before you do Lab 5. Now I'm assuming that everyone has by now watched my earlier video which explained how to get access to the SQL Server class database. If you haven't watched that, please go ahead and watch that now. You'll need to watch that video to know how to get your password off the iSchool website and how to get the software you need and to connect to the class SQL Server. So, since you've done that already, I assume, we'll jump right into how to do some SQL coding in SQL Server. So there are three things you need to do in Lab 5. You need to create tables, you need to insert data to the tables, and you need to select data from the tables. So what I've done is I've created a simple data model here, and we'll go through this data model and show how we would create these tables, create the primary keys, foreign keys, create a check constraint, and insert data, and then select data. So let's get started. First, I'm going to need SU remote access going so I can connect to the school server. So we'll get that running. Good. Now we need to fire up SQL Management Studio. There's that. Now, by the way, in my earlier video, I didn't mention the server name to connect to, so I had a few questions about that. It's iststudents.sor.edu. So, again, I apologize for not mentioning that in my other video. So anyway, let's connect. Just typing in my password. Okay, now that you're connected, what you'll do is browse the database list until you find your database. Just look for your net ID. Okay, there's mine. I'll hit new query. Now, let's see what tables I have. I have a few tables here because I was going through some of the steps that I was going to do for this video earlier. So I have a few tables already. What I'll do is I'm just going to delete all my tables. Oops. I tried to delete a table that had a relationship, a foreign key, so didn't like that. It is actually deleting these, it just for whatever reason doesn't like to refresh. Oh, there it goes. Okay, let's get rid of this one. Okay, that's cleared away. And this was just a test table I created just to make sure I had permissions to create it. So now we're all cleared out. Good. So let's go ahead and start creating tables. So we want to start by creating our publisher table, because this table, for example, has a foreign key to publisher, so we actually could not create this one first. We have to do publisher first. It's a pretty simple table, just 2 columns. So how do you do this? Well, first I like to add a little comment at the beginning of my SQL statements. Let's just say create table publisher, and you're going to use the create table statement, then the name of your table. Then I like to go to the next line and then put my open parenthesis. Go to the next line, tab over. Now SQL Server does not care about where you put your white space, whether you have carriage returns or tabs or whatever, but it just makes it more readable if you sort of line things up in a logical way when you're writing your code. So let's type in the names of our columns. Publisher ID is the name. Let's make this an integer. So in Access, you would type in the names of your columns and then you would select the data type from a drop-down list. Here we have to type in the name, so integer, and not null. That means publisher ID cannot be null, it's required, comma, publisher name. Let's make that, what we have in SQL Server is a varchar. That basically means it's a variable length string that you can put anything in, letters, numbers, whatever. So anytime you have a name or address or anything with letters and numbers, you should use a varchar. And I think that probably 100 will be long enough, so we'll put 100. Let's say publisher name also should be not null. Now what we have to do is put in our constraints. So there are three types of constraints that we'll worry about for this lab. We have primary keys, which enforce entity integrity, that make sure we don't have duplicates. We have foreign keys, which make sure that the data in one table is present before we add that data to another table. For example, make sure a book ID exists before it goes in a orders table, that kind of thing. So those foreign keys were what you set up in the relationships window in Access. But in SQL Server, you actually type in code to create them. So we've got the foreign key, the primary key, the foreign key, and finally the check constraint. The check constraint is what you do if you want to limit the values that are allowed to be in a particular field. For example, you could say that birth date must be greater than some date, or you could say, order size must be greater than something. So we'll go through an example of that. But anyway, those are the three types of constraints. Now our publisher table is not going to have any foreign keys or check constraints. We'll just have a primary key for publisher ID. So what we'll do is we'll type constraint. That keyword needs to be first. Then you can give your primary key a name. It doesn't matter to SQL Server what name you give it, but for good naming conventions, usually what I do is just use table name underscore PK. Then you have to tell it what kind of constraint. It's a primary key. And then you have to tell it what field you want the primary key on. We want it on publisher ID. Now you can create a primary key on more than one column. If I were to do a comma and then another field name like that, which we'll do actually when we get to the book author table. But for this table we just have one column in our primary key. So close that up. Okay, so that's the end of what we need to declare for this table. You'll notice I need a comma after each column or constraint name, except the last one doesn't get a comma. Then close parenthesis, and I'm just going to move it over here. So what I'm going to do is select this code, highlight it, click execute. Okay, so I think it made our table. If I want to check, I can click here, right click on tables, hit refresh. There's our publisher table. Now we have this dbo.publisher. dbo is a schema name which can be used to organize tables into different groups or to assign different permissions to different schemas of tables. It's not something we'll worry about now, but it comes into play a lot when you're doing your database security. But for now, everything is going to have the DBO schema. Now let's see if we have any data in the table. Select star from publisher. So this is how you show all the data in a table. Select star means to select all columns from the publisher table. Show data table. Just adding a comment. So what happens if I run this? Well, you see my column names here, but there's no data to show. because I haven't added any. So how do we add data? Well, we use what's called an insert statement. It goes like this: insert into, and then the table name, publisher, and then you type values, open parenthesis. Now you're going to list all the values you want to insert. Now I should mention that when you're inserting integers, you don't put single quotes around the values you're inserting. For varchars and dates, you do put single quotes. So what I would do to insert a publisher is, let's put in a publisher ID of 1, and maybe publisher name could be Penguin. Okay. So you'll notice here, publisher ID is 1, and publisher name, since it's a varchar, we need these two single quotes. Now, something you can do in order to make it a little easier in your insert statements to see what columns are going into what fields is to put a list of which columns you're inserting into. This is actually optional. If you are inserting to every column, then this part is optional. It would work like this, or it would work with this list of column names, but I'm just going to leave this list of column names here so it's a little more clear what value is going into what column. So let's run this. Okay, one row affected, that means we inserted one row. Now when we run this again, you can see there's the data. Let's add a little more data. So I'm going to copy and paste this statement so I don't have to retype everything. Now what would happen if we tried to enter the same publisher ID twice? Would we get an error? Let's see what happens. Yes, violation of primary key publisher PK. We have a primary key on publisher ID, so we cannot insert two rows with the same publisher ID. Let's change this to 2. There we go. So that worked. By the way, if you don't see me clicking execute, F5 is the shortcut to execute, so often I'll just hit F5 instead of clicking. So now let's see what our data looks like. Okay, we have 2 rows now. Let's add one more row. Just going to copy and paste. Okay. Now let's see what we have in the table. Good, 3 records. So this would be a good time to show a couple features of the select statement. Now I'm doing select star to show everything, but what if I only wanted to show certain records? We only have 3 records here, so showing everything is just convenient. But what if we wanted to say only show one record from the table? Well, you can use what's called a where clause to filter the results that come back. And the way you use this is you say where, then you say your column name. Let's say we want to only show records where the publisher ID equals 3. So just show this record here. Okay? So that's what the where clause is for. Good. So we just showed that. Now let's say we want to, instead of doing that, let's take this away. Let's say we only want to show certain columns. So the where clause filters the rows. If we want to show just one column or just several columns, we can, instead of saying star, say the name of the column. Okay. So let's run this. Now this will just show the publisher name. And finally, we can actually do both at once. We can filter by column and row by putting in a column name here and a where clause here. Or let's say publisher ID equals 3 again. Maybe 2 this time. Oops, I selected my extra row up top there by mistake. Okay, so there we go. So now you know how to do a create statement, how to insert some data, and how to do a select, as well as how to filter by rows and columns. So that covers one of our tables. Let's move on now and create the book table. So before I create the book table, I just realized there are some cleanup things I need to do. SQL Server doesn't require you to put semicolons at the end, but it is considered a best practice. For example, if you're planning on migrating this code at some point to another DBMS, some DBMSs are pickier about needing the semicolons. So just at the end of each select, insert, and create, you should have one. Also, each block of code should really get a comment. So fill publisher table. Okay, now we're good. So let's work on the next table. Oops, hit the wrong thing. By the way, maybe this is a good time to tell you how to save your SQL. So you can just go File, Save As, and this is just a file with your code in it. This file won't have any data. It's just your code that you're using to create the tables and insert and select. So let's just call this Lab 5 testing or something. Okay, let's go back here. So we did publisher. Now we need to do book. So book is a little more complex. Book will be a little more fun because we do have a primary key. I better plug my laptop in. Okay, it's plugged in. So what are we going to do with book? Well, book is going to have a primary key. We also get to make a foreign key, and I'm going to make a check constraint on book pages. That's going to be an integer, but I want the book pages to always be 0 or more. I don't want any negative numbers in this field. So I'll show how to create that check constraint. Let's create our book table. This will be a similar process to our publisher table. Just adding my comment. So create table, we always have that, but now we want to say book. Open parenthesis, tab over, book ID, integer, not null because that will be a primary key. And you'll notice on my data model I made all these fields bold, which means they're required. So these will all be not null. When we create the author table, we will have two fields here that can be null. So we'll get to that. Book ID, publisher ID, what else do we need? Book title. This is a varchar. Varchar is just what Access calls text, or what some programming languages call a string. So varchar, book title, maybe 200, just in case we have a very long title. Book year. I think book year we can make an integer. We could make it a date time, like this, but that would kind of be unnecessary because we won't be storing the month and day that the book was published, just the year. So the integer takes up less room in the database, so let's just go with integer. Not null. So every book needs a year, and every book needs a number of pages. So that's all 5 columns. Now let's do the constraints. First, I'm going to list my primary key constraint. So constraints, book PK is what I'll call it. Now, just to show that it doesn't really matter to SQL Server what I call this, I'm just going to put some extra characters in there. This is really just a name that you create for yourself, just so if you're looking like at the list of constraints here, or keys or whatever, the names will make sense. But you don't have to give them good names in order to make SQL Server happy, but you should give them good names so the code will be more maintainable. So anyway, this is going to be a primary key, and what column? Book ID. Okay, so that's it. What's next? The next thing we need is a foreign key. So publisher ID will be a foreign key to the publisher ID field in the publisher table. In other words, the publisher needs to exist here before we can assign a book to a publisher. So we always start with constraint. Now let's name our constraint. For the foreign keys, the naming convention I usually use is table name underscore column name, that will be the foreign key, underscore FK for foreign key. And again, we don't have to use good naming conventions to please SQL Server, so that's just kind of what we do for ourselves. Anyway, that's a foreign key. And what column will be the foreign key? The foreign key is going to be publisher ID. Now we need to put in this, now we need to tell it what table it's referencing and what field it's referencing. So in Access, you'd be using the GUI, the relationships window, to drag the field. So if we were dragging this in Access, we would drop it here on publisher ID. So let's do references, publisher table, publisher ID column. So you have to tell it both the table and column. Okay. Now what? Now let's put in our check constraint. Again, you start with constraint. Let's put a check constraint on year, or I'm sorry, on pages, to make that require us to have a positive or zero number for book pages. So let's call it book pages CK for check. And then what column would be book pages, or I'm sorry, you open the parenthesis and then you put in your check constraint. So book pages needs to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so that should be the entire table. Close parenthesis. Okay, let's see if this will create. I see some red here, but we'll see. Oops, we have a problem. Oh, you know what the problem is? I think this is supposed to be in parentheses. Then the comma. Now, let's see what happens. Oops, it's becoming happier. Some red went away. We still have this problem. Oh. We need the keyword check, right. Now let's try, oh, no more red. There, good. So just a review over constraints, because I messed up the code a little. We always start with constraint, then we have the name, which we create. We can say foreign key, primary key, foreign key, or check. For a primary key constraint, you put the column or columns in parentheses. For a foreign key constraint, same thing, but you also need to tell it what table and column it references. And then for check constraint, you just put the expression here, or the equation, I should say. So book pages needs to be greater than or equal to 0. So we finally created that table. Let's refresh. There we go. Now what's kind of interesting is you can expand this and look at your columns. You'll notice this little key icon. That's just like access, where it puts the foreign key with a, or I'm sorry, the primary key with a little key column. Publisher ID says FK and it has a little gray key, which means foreign key. And here we have our check constraint. Here we have our primary key and our foreign key, and you'll notice it used the same name that I created here. So that's why it's good to have a good naming convention, because if you look at your list of keys, it's good to see a list that makes sense. So the names are kind of self-explanatory, instead of, like I did, just putting in some extra characters and confusing things. So anyway, we are done there. Let's see if we have any data. Select star from book. Should be blank table. Good. Okay, let's add some data. So just like last time, let me put my semicolon in. Okay, insert into book. Now let's put in the column names, which is optional. Book title. Oops. Book year. Okay, and now what values? The values, book ID, let's do 1. So what publisher should this book be for? Well, let's see what publishers we have. I'm just going to change this back to show all records. Just hitting F5 to execute. Okay, we have publisher IDs 1, 2, and 3. What happens if we try to put in a publisher ID of 5? Book title, book year. Oops, forgot to close my single quote. And because book ID, publisher ID, book year, and book pages are integers, they don't need the single quote, but this string here needs a single quote. What would happen if we didn't have the string? It would get confused. See, if we tried to run this now, see, incorrect syntax. It thinks old is some kind of command keyword, so that's why you need to do that. Okay, let's see if this inserts. So the statement conflicted with a foreign key constraint. Book ID, I'm sorry, book publisher ID FK. So this constraint, because we don't have a publisher ID 5 in our publisher table. Let's change that to 3. Now it's going to work. Oops. Need that. Good. Let's show the data. Good. Let's put in 2 more books. Just copying and pasting. Let's change this to book 2, maybe same publisher. How about this one is, oops. Okay, insert this one, hit F5. Let's put one more in there. Book ID 3. Let's say this is publisher 2. Okay, insert that. Now we should have 3 records in here. Okay, so there you see we have our book IDs, which must be unique, foreign key to the publisher table, and then the data. So that covers our book table. What's next? Let's make an author table. Now, author table is going to have a primary key, no foreign keys, but we are no constraints either. So it'll be a pretty simple table. We'll go through it quickly. So always start with create table, then the table name. Let's put our columns in. Make our primary key an integer, not null. We'll say all authors need a first name. Oops, not int. Let's make that like a varchar 50. Author last name. Varchar 50 also. Let's say everybody needs a last name. But for middle initial, let's make that optional. So we'll say varchar 1. And we'll just say null. Null means that it's allowed to be null, which means it's allowed to be missing. And finally, date of birth. This is not in bold here on my diagram, so that means it's optional. Let's make that actually a date time field. And we can say that can be null also. So we have all our columns. The only constraint we'll have on this table is a primary key. Let's call it author pk, primary key, and we'll make it on the author ID column. Now we should be able to close up our parenthesis. Let's make sure this works. We'll execute this code. Good. Now refresh here and we should see, good. There's our author table. You can see our primary key here and the rest of our columns. Let's put some data in. Oops. Maybe this time I won't put in this list of columns just to show how it's optional. And again, we need the single quotes for the strings. Author middle initial, we'll leave that blank, and the way you do a missing value or a blank value in SQL Server is to type the keyword null, and null does not have quotes on it. Date of birth, I have no idea. That should work. Again, I forgot my optional semicolon. Let's see what happens. Hit execute. Okay. Let's do a select statement to show all the authors. Good, there it is. And you can see author middle initial null. And you also notice, well, yeah, there's no quotes around that when you put it in. Okay, let's put one more author in. I'll copy and paste. Now what I'm going to show is what you would do if you didn't want to worry about putting this null in here. What you could actually do is when you insert, you could tell it only to insert to certain columns. So what we're doing is I'm going to put author ID, author first name, author last name, and let's say those are the only columns I want to insert to, because these two columns are optional. So if I just want to insert values to 3 columns, I'm just going to do this. So let's put Hemingway. Then I'll actually delete this. Now you can only do this, you can only skip columns here when you insert if the columns are not required, because these say null. If I tried to do an insert here to this table and didn't include an author first name here, it would give me a warning, or an error I should say, It says you cannot insert a null value to author first name. Let's insert this. Oh. Oops, I forgot to put in a new author ID. Let's try that again. Good. Show all authors. Alright, so what do we see here? We have unique author IDs, we have author first and last names. Neither author has a middle initial, so these are null. We have one author with a date of birth in our system, and this one we did not record a date of birth, so it's null. So the next thing we need to do is do our final table, the book author table. This will be an interesting table because we have a primary key made up of 2 fields instead of 1. So we have both of these columns being primary and foreign keys, and we will not be having any check constraints. Let's create our final table. So create table, name of table, open parenthesis, first column, book ID, int not null, next one, author ID, int not null. Now we need our primary key constraint. So constraint keyword, book author PK, that's the name we'll give it. We'll tell it it's a primary key, and here's the interesting part. For the other primary keys, for the other tables, you can see our primary keys were just 1 column. Right. But in this case, our primary key will have 2 columns part of it. So we'll have 2 column names separated by commas. So the primary key will be a combination of these 2 fields because it's a bridge table. Let's create a foreign key. Actually, we'll need 2 foreign keys, one for book ID, one for author ID. So book author, book ID, FK, that's my naming convention, foreign key. What column is the foreign key in this? For this one, it's going to be book ID, and then we need references. So what table does it reference? Book ID references the book table, book ID field. Okay, we need another one, another foreign key. Let's call this book author, author ID, FK, foreign key. That's for the author ID field. And this one references the author table, author ID. Close up parenthesis. So let's run this. This should create a book author table. Okay, let's refresh our tables, make sure it's there. Good. Book author. Here's our 2 columns. They're both primary keys and foreign keys. Let's insert some data. We'll be inserting to both columns, so I'm not going to list the column names in my insert statement. Let's say first we need to see who's author ID 1, who's book ID 1. So the Old Man in the Sea, book ID 1, would go with author ID 2, Ernest Hemingway. So book ID is 1, author ID is 2. And these are integers, so we don't need the single quotes. Let's insert it. Oops. I hit F4 instead of F5. Now, finally, let's select our data. F5. Okay, so book ID 1, author is 2. So book ID Old Man in the Sea goes with Ernest Hemingway. Now let's do, where's it, book ID 2? Let's do book ID 3 next. So War and Peace is book ID 3, and it matches with author Leo Tolstoy. Let's copy and paste. So book ID 3 goes with author ID 1. Let's look at the data. Okay. So there's one more thing I want to do. Now, because this is a bridge table and we have a many-to-many relationship between book and author, we can have one book with more than one author. So let's pretend, just for demonstration purposes, that The Sun Also Rises was written by both Hemingway and Tolstoy. How would we do that? Let's copy. So The Sun Also Rises is book ID 2. So we'll say book ID 2 has author ID 1, good, and book ID 2 has author ID 2. So that means this book has multiple authors. Let's execute. Now we have 2 more rows in our table. We should have a total of 4 rows. So as you can see, book ID 1 has author ID 2. Book ID 2 actually has 2 authors, and book ID 3 has author ID 1. So you can see that one author can write multiple books, like we've got author ID 1 wrote book 2 and book 3, and then one book can have many authors. So that's how this bridge table works. So in conclusion, what we've learned during this video is how to create statements for tables here, and that includes creating the columns, primary key constraints, foreign key constraints, and check constraints. Then we learned how to insert data into the tables, and finally we learned how to select data from tables, including how to filter using the where clause to show only certain rows. So I hope this video was useful, and now you can move on to Lab 5. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thanks.